if we're going to understand something about Lacan's approach to dreams, one of the challenges that lies ahead is grasping the importance of the notion of the subject. So in this talk on Lacan and Dreams, we're going to say a little bit about that, and we're also going to think a little bit about the relationship between the imaginary and the symbolic. And we're going to stick fairly closely to Lacan's text. So in chapter and session 12 of Seminar 2, which directly precedes Lacan's engagement with and discussion of Irma's dream, he is going to give us a famous footnote reference. And for many Lacanians, this is a crucial part of the interpretation of dreams. The famous chapter 7 of Interpretation of Dreams has this footnote, which was added in 1919. And of course, we know that by this stage in the text, we're 580 pages in. Freud's given us a lot on dreams. And of course, the basic premise seems to be that a dream is a disguised expression of suppressed, he sometimes says, or repressed infantile wish. And of course, we've got the whole notion of wish fulfillment. So we have a pretty strong thesis that what we're seeing in a dream is a disguised expression of a wish. So that thesis is developed all the way through, and then suddenly in 1919, 19 years after the publication of the text, Freud adds a footnote which asks a question. He says, okay, no doubt, wish fulfillment must bring pleasure, but the question then arises, to whom? So at this point we go, okay, so it's all about a wish being pictured, a wish being fulfilled, but we didn't really ask the question of for whom the wish should be expressed, or for whom the pleasure associated to should be fulfilled. Freud's question is, the wish fulfillment must bring pleasure, but the question is, to whom? To the person who has the wish, of course. Okay. But as we know, a dreamer's relationship to his wishes is a quite peculiar one. He repudiates them and censors them. Those are the lines that Lacan quotes. He has no liking of them. In short, Freud continues the footnote, their fulfillment will give him no pleasure, but just the opposite. And experience shows that this opposite appears in the form of anxiety, a fact which still has to be explained. Thus, a dreamer in his relation to his dream wishes can only be compared to an amalgamation of two separate people who are linked by some important common element. So this is amazing, this is significant. Not only does he say their fulfillment, a fulfillment of one's wish can give one no pleasure, just the opposite, experience shows that this opposite appears in the form of anxiety. Now, one immediately appreciates why this is a significant footnote, because so many dreams are not just dreams of a disguised wish fulfillment, they have the component or the aspect of anxiety. So that opens up the point that what we wish for might produce a great deal of anxiety, and indeed that what we wish for might not be what we wish for, but what one other facet of the psychical apparatus wishes for. There's division in the very wish, and there's division in the desire exemplified in the wish. Now, I'm just trying to stress this point because, as we'll see, Lacan makes the point several times very strongly by the time of Seminar 6. What he's interested in dreams is not merely a wish which could be related back to an ego and which could be seen to be a kind of imaginarization, imaginary object or something of that sort. He's much more interested in the desire that starts to be shown in wishes. And from this example, we can see that desire, the index of desire might be much more anxiety, right, than simply pleasure. And I think Freud's making that point. So the little example he goes on to give, and you'll see I've numbered this 0.5, the story of sausages is a funny one. I've used it before in these lectures, and Freud himself says this tale might be used in many other illustrative connections. But you know it, so let's do it quickly, even though you know it, and I know it, maybe you don't know it, but anyways, here it is. So it's a fairy tale, there's a knock on the door. The guy opens the door. Fairy is there. Actually, I'm not sure if he says fairy, but we'll go with, oh no, he does. A good fairy promised a poor married couple. A good fairy arrives and says, what would you like? I can give you 3 wishes. And so the husband arrives and he's like, whoa, it's happy day time, it's wish day. I keep on waiting for this day, it hasn't happened yet. Anyways, So he's like, wow, wishes, this is fantastic. Unfortunately, the neighbor across the road is cooking some delicious sausages, and he immediately wishes for some sausages. His wife comes in and goes, what the hell are you doing? You're wishing for sausages? You could have wished for $1 million. You idiot. These sausages belong on your nose. Next thing, the sausages are affixed to the husband's nose, and that's the second wish gone. And hence, says Freud, the poor couple was obliged to use their third wish to remove the sausages from the husband's nose. Funnily enough, I think I've done a bit of a gender switch. It's actually the wife's nose in Freud, but fine, we're good with that. So the point of this significant footnote is that the wish is not uncomplicated. And if we wanted to do a Lacanian reading of that, you could say that the wish is itself split, or the source of the wish is split, divided. It's not consistent. It's not simply coherent. We can wish for things that we don't wish for. We can wish for things that are traumatic for us. We can wish for things that are bad for us. You could say, how else could it be? And so many fairy tales seem to play out exactly that dilemma. But it also seems to suggest that we need to keep in mind the distinction between wish and desire, and that desire kind of eludes us. Desire is something that is undermining of the stability and the coherence, the imaginary narrative coherence of a mere wish. So that point is made, and I hope fairly well. So Freud is cited by Lacan, and then we skip a couple of pages, and he wants to insist in the first few pages of talking about Irma's dream. He says, the essence of the Freudian discovery is that of the decentering of the subject in relation to the ego. And we need to oppose, he says, this notion that everything centers on the standard development of the ego. So if you know anything about Lacan, that is not a new assertion. For him, ego psychology and those modes of psychoanalysis that want to centralize and focalize, we could say, the ego, are part of the problem. In fact, for him, the subject is the thing that is where we need to go, so to speak, if we want to access something of desires. And the subject is that thing which the ego tries to evade in some respects. So another nice moment just to try and give us a little connection point to what is this notion of the subject. I want to briefly quote Olga Cox-Cameron. This is a really terrific book studying Lacan's Seminar 6, which is by Olga Cox-Cameron and Carol Owens. And Olga has a really nice chapter here. It's called A Masterclass in Dream Interpretation. Much more focused on a dream interpretation that Lacan does in Seminar 6, but excellent chapter, really well worth reading. And she makes a few remarks about, and I'll say, Lacan solders Freud's project to his own. And she's going to say something about the notion of the subject. This is important both in terms of how we're reading Lacan and his relationship to Freud, but also there's a link here to linguistics. So she says, the first point to be made here is Freud's emphasis on those elements in the narrative of the dream that reveal the enunciating subject, in particular, the dreamer's vagueness or propensity to distance herself from bits of the dream. In other words, doubt, indirect reportage of someone else's words, riddles, enigmas, all herald the enunciating subject. Doubt, in fact, is to be read as an indication of the emergence of the subject. So this is interesting because before in Freud's work we hear that thing, when there's a kind of vacillation, uncertainty, when the dreamer says it was this or not this, I'm not sure. All of those are moments that we should get our highlighters out and say, okay, this is a moment where we can hear something of the unconscious. That's rearticulated and emphasized in Lacan, but with a particular sense that these are the moments that herald the enunciating subject. So that's a nice qualification. When the subject is coming closer, there's a kind of it does so by virtue of these enunciations, these qualifications, these uncertainties. Olga Cox-Cameron goes on to say, Lacan's importation of contemporary linguistics into psychoanalytic theory is something we should note here. Emile Benveniste makes exactly the same point when he isolates phrases like I think, I feel, I believe, as the indices of enunciating, the phrases by which the enunciation is appropriated, earned by the subject. So in other words, these qualifications before something is said are significant. Maybe they point to the emergence of something of the subject, and the subject as that thing which the ego tries to evade, and that subject, this being Lacanian psychoanalysis, is always the subject of desire, which is what one is listening for, right? She makes two further points. The enunciating subject can be traced directly to Freud himself, as can the fragmented signifying chain that specifies unconscious discourse. Hence the importance of free association, she says. And then she also says that Freud is at pains to show that the often reasonable, coherent story of the dream is generally speaking a facade, which, while sometimes in itself significant, is mostly a jumble of fragments. And of course, you may remember earlier on, I made reference in a previous talk to Bruce Fink's idea that whereas Freud seems to be focused on the picturing of a wish, what we see in Lacan is much more interest in when something goes wrong, when there's some kind of moment of uncertainty or rupture or failure. And you can now get a sense from what I've just said about the subject that those are points when you could suggest that something of desire is coming to the fore. Okay, so we've told ourselves a parable about sausages. We've said something about the subject emerging in dreams. Now let's ask a few more points about what's going on that's most crucial in Lacan's opening comments on the Irma's dream. Right, so he wants to note a couple of things. We've seen this essence of the Freudian discovery, which he wants to stress is so very important. I've already mentioned also that he does a kind of Freudian thing. He points out that Freud has the feeling that he has put the right solution to Irma, and then is the word Losun, sorry for the lack of any German accent or pronunciation, L-O-S-U-N. And Lacan dutifully goes on to say, this word has the same ambiguity in German as in French. It is much a solution that one injects as the solution of a conflict. With that, the dream of Irma's injection is already acquiring its symbolic meaning. Very Freudian remark, when there's a word that appears in the retelling of a dream, one wants to listen to it in the double register of presumably what it is intended, but also, here comes the subject, of the enunciated dimension, the other facet of what that word might mean. So we've got that. Then Freud already mentions this, but Lacan reiterates it, the story of the kettle. Okay, I mean, I know Slavoj Žižek uses this in many different contexts. Well, if you don't know the story of the broken, borrowed kettle, here it comes. He says, Freud considers it a great success to be able to explain this dream in all its detail. And just to reiterate, we're still with Irma's dream, which in many respects seems to be Freud's attempt to exculpate himself, to excuse himself from any responsibility for the direness and the truly awful medical situation that Irma is in. He has the desire to be relieved of this responsibility for the failure of Irma's treatment. He does so in the dream as the artisan of the dream in many ways, that, as he remarks with his customary humor, bear great resemblance to the story of the person who, upon being reproached with returning a kettle with a hole in it, answers firstly that when he returned it, it was intact, and secondly, that the kettle already had a hole in it when he borrowed it, and that thirdly, he hadn't borrowed it at all. Each of these explanations might be perfect on their own, but you could see how they undercut one another. Now, I just wanted to mention that not only because it's used in many different contexts, but also we have this repetition of a kind of threeness element, of a base symbolic element of a threeness that comes through in the dream. So it seems significant that Freud gives us that, and that Lacan repeats it. Now, of course, comes the big problem. And I do believe someone as unpsychoanalytic and critical of psychoanalysis as Hans Eysenck, sorry for the mispronunciation, has already made this point. Owen Hewitson has written a very, very good number of articles on this section of Seminar 2 in his website, Lacan Online, reading Seminar 2. He's got a succession of articles, and he makes that point. This is a critique that's directed from outside of psychoanalysis at Freud's interpretation of the Irma dream, and interestingly, Lacan reiterates that. If the whole thesis of the interpretation of dreams is that a dream pictures, expresses a wish in a disguised form, where we need to bear in mind that most fundamentally the wish concerned is a repressed infantile wish, then you could say that the great specimen dream of psychoanalysis is itself a kind of demonstration by way of failure. Oh, how can that be the case? Well, Eysenck makes the point, Lacan makes the point too. Freud's interpretation of the dream doesn't give us a repressed wish. He tells us that the dream is there to try to relieve him of responsibility for what has happened with Irma. You could say that is a completely conscious, maybe pre-conscious as well, but a completely conscious wish. So you could say that the dream is not interpreted according to Freud's own criteria. Here's how Lacan puts it. How is it that Freud, who later on will develop the function of unconscious desire, is here content for the first step in his demonstration to present a dream which is entirely explained by the satisfaction of a desire which one cannot but call pre-conscious and even entirely conscious? So Lacan's using the word desire here, but I think it's more faithful to his argument, general unfolding argument, to say wish. But that's the point. Where's the unconscious desire in the dream? Now, I'm not hugely impressed with those. I mean, it's an argument worth noting. I'm not necessarily hugely impressed with it because there's a number of times when Freud says, essentially, I'm not going to go there. And there's a number of moments when we have Irma, who is considered in a series of other women, a much nicer, prospectively better analysand or patient than Irma. She is also in a series that could potentially be linked to Freud's own wife. There's a moment he looks into her mouth, he looks into these organs, and of course, you don't have to think very far about what might be some of the sexual connotations of that particular moment in the dream. So yes, I think it is legitimate to say on one level that Freud seems to fail by his own criteria in what he's willing to say about the dream, but it's also pretty clear, I think, that there's a lot that he is very open about. I'm not going to go into those facets of the dream for kind of obvious reasons. So let us then build on the following point that Lacan wants to make about this. I mean, we could say then that Freud's first opening interpretive step into the dream is but a first step, and that there's more to be said by way of desire of the subject. And that's an opposition that I'm going to keep on reiterating. We're looking for the desire of the subject rather than the wish of the ego. Okay? Desire of the subject rather than merely a wish of the ego. Lacan is constantly going to make, well, not constantly, fairly frequently make references to Erik Erikson. It's a kind of odd move because Erik Erikson's paper, which is published around about the same time, it's kind of a substantial engagement with Freud. He makes some good points, but the overall, and what's kind of odd in reading it, is he does this pretty Freudian thing in many instances, makes a whole lot of historical observations which are pertinent to the dream. But towards the end does this thing which presumably many theorists do. They want to use the dream as evidence for their own theory. And Erikson wants to see in the dream an evidence for the fact that there are multiple stages of Freud's ego, that the dream is dreamt at a certain stage in Freud's professional life, and hence he wants to be able to track various egoic moments or egoic stages or identity stages in the dream. Lacan's going to go in a very different way, even we could say in opposite direction. But one of the things that he says, which I think is, we'll just make two further points. One of the things that he says, which is kind of interesting, he says, when we're thinking about a dream, and we could see this in Freud's work, there are two operations. Okay, we're on now 152 of Seminar 2. There are two operations, having the dream and interpreting the dream. Interpreting is an operation where we have to intervene. But don't forget that in the majority of the cases, we also intervene in the first, in the having of the dream. In an analysis, we intervene not only in that we interpret the dream of the subject, if indeed we do interpret it, sorry for the stressing at that point, if indeed we do interpret it, because in the first lecture in the series, I made a series of points about that. We intervene not only in that we interpret the dream, but on account of our already being, as analysts, in the life of the subject, we are already in his dream. Okay, in other words, we want to think about two operations, having the dream and interpreting it. But to note that the having of the dream doesn't happen outside of the transference dimension of the analysis in the first place. Many psychoanalytic commentators on dreams make this observation, but here we are, very clearly, Lacan is making that again. But then he's also saying something about not just having the dream, in which a process in which the analyst is involved, but there's also something to be said about interpreting the dream. So here he starts talking about the three registers. The three registers are significant in this period in Lacan's work. He wants to obviously say that something like this notion of regression isn't quite what he wants it to be. He thinks that a great deal of clarity and a great deal of theoretical and conceptual importance comes with noting these aspects, imaginary, symbolic, and real. If only Freud had these ideas, he sometimes seems to suggest. But then he says we have two different operations. Imagining the symbol, and he puts a little I with an S, imagining the symbol. This, he says, is putting the symbolic discourse into a figurative form, namely the dream itself. We could maybe slightly change his terminology, and he says imagining the symbol. We could say imaginarizing the signifier, if we want to use a slightly later Lacanian kind of vernacular. Imaginarizing signifiers, imaginarizing a signifier. That is what happens in the dream because we have pictorial experiential form given to ideas. Imaginarizing the symbol or the signifier. But the other direction seems to, or operation, seems to be symbolizing the image. And here he gives us an S with a capital I. He says symbolizing the image, making a dream interpretation. Symbolizing the image, making a dream interpretation, or in the language of maybe a slightly later Lacan, we could say signifierizing the imaginary, or signifierizing imaginary contents. Signifierizing imaginary contents, symbolizing the image, is, he says, making a dream interpretation. We'll go back to his comments on triethylamine. And you'll remember how I said this was such a quizzical, puzzling thing, that it was, this is the meaning of the dream. Interestingly then, if this signifierizing or symbolizing the image, giving it a symbolic form, is an interpretation, is the operation of interpretation, then you could say that that enigmatic gesture is a kind of interpretation par excellence. So we'll stop there. In our next video, we'll speak a little bit about the Holy Writ. We'll talk about the scriptures. We'll talk about why the symbolic and the message in the dream has this almost quasi-religious writing on the wall quality for Lacan. And with that, we will also try and speak about this moment when in the dream, Freud peers into Irma's mouth, sees her throat, and see what Lacan has to say about that.